At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in the basement of Building 1 at Pearl Harbor, staring at a decrypted Japanese message that would change the course of the Pacific War. The message was incomplete, filled with gaps and code groups that remained unbroken, but 3 characters were crystal clear: AF. The Japanese were planning a massive operation against AF. Rochefort had spent 6 weeks arguing with his superiors that AF meant Midway Island. Now, 200 miles northwest of Hawaii, 3 American aircraft carriers were positioning themselves to ambush a Japanese fleet that had no idea the Americans were waiting. The Japanese believed their communications were completely secure, protected by a code system they considered unbreakable. They were wrong. The story of how American codebreakers cracked Japan's JN-25 naval code is a tale of mathematical brilliance, tireless dedication, and strategic deception that culminated in the most decisive naval battle of World War II. It began not in 1942, but years earlier, when the United States Navy recognized that future wars would be won or lost based on information. In 1924, the Navy established the Code and Signal Section, later redesignated as OP-20G, the Cryptanalysis Division of the Office of Naval Communications. The mission was straightforward: break foreign codes and protect American ones. The challenge was that modern encryption systems had become extraordinarily complex. The Japanese Navy, learning from European cryptographic advances, had developed a machine-assisted code system that combined traditional codebooks with cipher overlays, creating layers of encryption that seemed impenetrable. The system the Americans called JN-25 was actually a series of related codes used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. JN stood for Japanese Navy, and the number 25 indicated it was the 25th distinct Japanese naval code system identified by American cryptanalysts. The Japanese called it something entirely different, a designation that remains unclear even today. But JN-25 became the American shorthand for the primary operational code used by Japanese fleet commanders to transmit orders, intelligence reports, and strategic plans. The code worked through a 2-step process. First, Japanese radio men converted their plain text messages into 5-digit code groups using a codebook. The codebook contained approximately 45,000 entries, each representing a word, phrase, or concept. For example, code group 112345 might represent the word battleship, while 6-7-8-9 might mean proceed to. The radio man looked up each word in his message and wrote down the corresponding 5-digit code group. This produced a message that was already encrypted, but the Japanese added a second layer of protection. They used an additive book containing pages of random 5-digit numbers. The radio man selected a starting point in the additive book, then added these random numbers to his code groups without carrying, a process called false addition. If the code group was 12345 and the additive was 6-7-8-9, the result would be 79235. This additively encrypted message was what got transmitted via radio. To decrypt the message, a Japanese receiver needed 3 things: the transmitted ciphertext, the same codebook used by the sender, and the same additive book. He would subtract the additive numbers to recover the original code groups, then look up those groups in the codebook to read the plain text message. Without the codebook and additive book, an interceptor would see only strings of meaningless 5-digit numbers. The Japanese believed this system was secure because even if an enemy somehow obtained the codebook, they would still need the additive book to make sense of intercepted messages. And the additive books changed periodically, sometimes as frequently as every few weeks. It seemed like perfect security. But the system had vulnerabilities, and American cryptanalysts spent years learning how to exploit them. The man who would become most associated with breaking JN-25 was Commander Joseph Rochefort, though he led a team of brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and analysts who deserve equal credit. Rochefort was born in 1900 in Dayton, Ohio, the same city that would later produce Tony Stein of Iwo Jima fame. He joined the Navy in 1918, learned Japanese during a 3-year posting to Japan in the 1920s, and became fascinated with cryptanalysis. By 1941, Rochefort commanded Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor. Hypo was one of 3 major American code-breaking stations focused on Japanese communications. The others were Station Cast in the Philippines and Station Negat in Washington, D.C. These 3 stations worked in coordination, sharing intercepted messages and cryptanalytic breakthroughs, though they also competed for resources and recognition. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Station Hypo was partially reading JN-25, but not well enough or quickly enough to provide tactical warning of the attack. The Japanese had changed their additive book on December 1st, and Hypo had not yet solved enough of the new additives to decrypt operational messages in real time. This failure haunted Rochefort and his team. They had been working on JN-25 for years. They had made progress. But when it mattered most, they could not read the messages that would have revealed Japanese intentions. After Pearl Harbor, breaking JN-25 became the highest priority for American cryptanalysis in the Pacific. Rochefort moved his operation into the basement of Building 1, a windowless concrete structure that offered both security and isolation. His team worked around the clock in shifts, 7 days a week, subsisting on coffee and sandwiches, sleeping on cots when exhaustion forced them to rest. The basement was hot, poorly ventilated, and filled with the constant clatter of IBM tabulating machines that helped process intercepts and test cryptanalytic theories. The process of breaking JN-25 was mathematically complex, but can be understood through basic principles. American listening stations across the Pacific intercepted Japanese radio transmissions constantly. Every message sent by Japanese ships, bases, and headquarters was captured if it fell within range of American receivers. These intercepts were forwarded to Hypo, Cast, and Negat as raw ciphertext, strings of 5-digit numbers. The first challenge was identifying which messages used JN-25 and which used other Japanese codes. The cryptanalysts developed identification techniques based on message length, transmission procedures, and characteristic patterns in the ciphertext. Once a message was confirmed as JN-25, the real work began. Without the codebook or additive book, Rochefort's team had to reconstruct both through pure analysis. They started with traffic analysis, studying the patterns of who sent messages to whom, how often, and in what circumstances. If a particular ship always sent a specific type of message before entering port, analysts could make educated guesses about what those messages contained. They looked for stereotyped phrases that appeared frequently in military communications, things like date-time groups, coordinate notations, and standard military terminology. The mathematical breakthrough came from understanding the properties of the additive system. Because the Japanese used false addition without carrying, certain mathematical patterns emerged. If you intercepted enough messages, you could identify cases where the same additive had been used multiple times, a practice called depth. When 2 messages used the same additive starting at the same point, you could exploit that overlap. By subtracting one encrypted message from another, the additive canceled out, leaving only the difference between the 2 underlying code groups. This difference could be analyzed for linguistic patterns. Japanese language structure, even when encoded, retained certain characteristics. The frequency of certain code groups, the patterns of how they appeared together, and the structural requirements of Japanese grammar all provided clues. Rochefort's team included Japanese language experts who understood these patterns intimately. They could look at decoded fragments and make educated guesses about surrounding text based on linguistic probability. The process was painstaking. A single 5-digit code group might take days or weeks to solve. Analysts would formulate hypotheses, test them against multiple messages, revise their theories, and test again. IBM punch card machines helped automate some of the testing, running through thousands of possible combinations to identify patterns humans might miss. But the fundamental work remained intellectual. Cryptanalysis in 1942 was as much art as science, requiring intuition, creativity, and the ability to recognize patterns in apparent randomness. By early 1942, Station Hypo was reading portions of JN-25 messages, perhaps 10 to 15% of the content on average. That percentage sounds small, but in military communications, even fragmentary intelligence can be enormously valuable. A message that was 85% unreadable might still reveal a date, a location, or a unit designation that provided critical context. As the team solved more code groups and additives, their ability to read new messages improved. Each solved group became a tool for solving others. By March 1942, Rochefort's team was reading 25 to 30% of intercepted JN-25 messages, enough to provide useful intelligence about Japanese intentions. In April 1942, American cryptanalysts noticed a surge in Japanese naval communications. Message volume increased dramatically, and the tone of the intercepts suggested major operational planning. The Japanese were preparing for something big. Partially decrypted messages mentioned an upcoming operation designated MI. Other messages referenced a target location using the designator AF. The Japanese used 2-letter geographic designators to conceal location names. AF appeared repeatedly in conjunction with the MI operation. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway Island, a small American base 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway consisted of 2 tiny islands surrounded by a coral atoll. It had an airfield, a small marine garrison, and strategic importance as the westernmost American position in the Central Pacific. If Japan captured Midway, they would eliminate a potential base for American attacks on their defensive perimeter. More importantly, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, believed an attack on Midway would force the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet to sortie for a decisive battle. Yamamoto intended to destroy the American carriers that had escaped the Pearl Harbor attack. The MI operation was designed as bait to lure the American fleet into a trap. But Rochefort's conclusion that AF meant Midway was not universally accepted. Cryptanalysts in Washington at Station Negat believed AF might refer to Oahu or even the Aleutian Islands. The partially decrypted messages were ambiguous. Without confirmation, the debate paralyzed planning. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, needed to know where to position his carriers. If AF was Midway, he could set his own ambush. If AF was somewhere else, moving carriers to Midway would leave the real target undefended. Rochefort needed proof. In late April, he devised a plan. If AF was truly Midway, he could trick the Japanese into confirming it. He proposed that Midway transmit a fake message in plain language, reporting a problem that the Japanese would find interesting. Nimitz approved the deception. On May 19th, Midway sent an unencrypted radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. The message was intentionally sent in a way that Japanese listening stations would intercept it. Then Rochefort's team waited. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message sent from the Kwajalein radio station to Combined Fleet Headquarters. The message was encrypted in JN-25, but when Rochefort's team decrypted the readable portions, they found exactly what they were looking for. The message reported that AF was experiencing freshwater supply problems. The trap had worked. AF was definitely Midway. Rochefort immediately informed Admiral Nimitz. Now the question became whether Nimitz could convince his superiors in Washington. Station Negat still disputed the identification, arguing that the freshwater ruse could have been detected by Japanese intelligence. The debate continued for several more days until Nimitz made the final decision. He would trust Rochefort's analysis. The Pacific Fleet would position itself to ambush the Japanese at Midway. By late May, American cryptanalysts were reading approximately 40% of Japanese messages related to the MI operation. That was enough to provide Nimitz with an intelligence picture that bordered on complete foreknowledge. Rochefort's team learned the composition of the Japanese attack force: 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports carrying 5,000 invasion troops. They learned the planned timing: an airstrike on Midway on June 4th, followed by an amphibious landing. They learned the approach route from the northwest. They even learned details about Japanese aircraft loadouts and fuel states. What the Japanese did not know, and could not know because they believed their codes were secure, was that 3 American carriers were already at sea northeast of Midway, positioned precisely where they could launch a surprise attack on the Japanese carrier force. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter hastily repaired after being damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea, carried approximately 230 aircraft. The Japanese carrier force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had approximately 248 aircraft. The numbers were nearly even, but the Americans had the critical advantage of foreknowledge. Nimitz knew where the Japanese would be and when they would arrive. Nagumo had no idea American carriers were anywhere near Midway. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike wave against Midway, 108 aircraft tasked with suppressing the island's defenses before the invasion force landed. The Japanese believed they were attacking a lightly defended outpost. They had no reason to expect opposition from American carriers. At 3:45 p.m., American patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed the contact report back to Midway and to the American carriers. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, immediately launched strike aircraft. He committed everything he had: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, sending them toward the last known position of the Japanese carriers. What happened over the next 4 hours became the turning point of the Pacific War, and it happened because American cryptanalysts had given their commanders the gift of perfect intelligence. The Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible situation. Their strike aircraft had attacked Midway and were returning to the carriers for refueling and rearming. The carrier decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines were connected, ordnance was being loaded. Nagumo had just received a report that American ships, possibly including a carrier, were in the area. He ordered his aircraft rearmed with anti-ship weapons instead of land attack bombs. The crews were frantically switching ordnance when American dive bombers appeared overhead. At 10:22 a.m., 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise began their attack. They dove from 14,000 feet at nearly vertical angles, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at 1,500 feet before pulling out. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit repeatedly within minutes. Bombs penetrated flight decks and detonated in the hangar spaces below, where armed and fueled aircraft were packed together. The resulting fires and explosions were catastrophic. All 3 carriers were burning uncontrollably within 6 minutes. A 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial attack and launched a counterstrike that damaged Yorktown. But American aircraft found Hiryu later that afternoon and destroyed her with bombs and torpedoes. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sinking or burning. The Japanese lost 248 aircraft and approximately 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots and aircrew. American losses were one carrier, Yorktown, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The Battle of Midway eliminated Japan's strategic offensive capability in the Pacific. Without their carrier striking power, the Japanese could no longer project force across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. The initiative passed permanently to the Americans. And it happened because Joseph Rochefort and his team in the basement of Building 1 had broken JN-25 well enough to give Admiral Nimitz the intelligence he needed to set a perfect ambush. The role of code-breaking in the Midway victory remained classified for decades after the war. Nimitz knew the intelligence was invaluable, but publicly acknowledging it would have alerted the Japanese that their codes were compromised. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, American commanders were careful to attribute their victory to superior tactics, training, and luck. The truth was more prosaic. They had read the enemy's mail. The Japanese, for their part, conducted investigations after Midway trying to understand how the Americans had known to position their carriers in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Some Japanese officers suspected their codes had been compromised, but the conclusion was rejected as impossible. The JN-25 system was too complex to break, or so Japanese cryptographers believed. They made minor modifications to their procedures, but did not fundamentally change the system. This was exactly what Rochefort had hoped for. As long as the Japanese kept using JN-25, American cryptanalysts could keep reading their messages. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, Station Hypo continued breaking JN-25 messages, providing intelligence that guided American strategy across the Pacific. One of the most famous intelligence coups came in April 1943, when Hypo intercepted and decrypted messages detailing an inspection tour by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. The decrypts revealed Yamamoto's exact itinerary, including his arrival time at Bougainville on April 18th. Admiral Nimitz authorized a long-range intercept mission. American P-38 fighters from Guadalcanal flew more than 400 miles to intercept Yamamoto's transport aircraft. They shot down his plane, killing Yamamoto. The operation was only possible because of JN-25 decrypts. The security surrounding code-breaking efforts was extreme. Only a handful of senior commanders knew about the intelligence source. Even Admiral William Halsey, one of the Pacific Fleet's most important combat commanders, was not fully briefed on cryptanalytic capabilities until mid-1942. Intelligence derived from code-breaking was distributed under the code name Magic, and later Ultra for high-level strategic intelligence. Officers receiving these reports were told the information came from highly reliable sources, but were not told those sources were decrypted enemy communications. This security was necessary because any hint that American codebreakers were reading Japanese messages would have prompted an immediate change in Japanese cryptographic systems. The risk was demonstrated in August 1942 when a Chicago Tribune reporter published an article that came dangerously close to revealing that the Navy had advance knowledge of Japanese plans at Midway. The article strongly implied American intelligence had intercepted and read Japanese communications. Navy officials were horrified. They considered prosecuting the reporter and newspaper for espionage, but ultimately decided a trial would only draw more attention to the issue. Fortunately, the Japanese did not see the article or did not draw the correct conclusions from it. JN-25 remained in use. Joseph Rochefort himself became a victim of inter-service politics. After Midway, he continued providing vital intelligence, but his relationship with cryptanalysts in Washington deteriorated. Station Nagant officers resented Rochefort's success and his direct access to Admiral Nimitz. They lobbied to have him removed from command of Station Hypo. In October 1942, Rochefort was reassigned to administrative duties and later sent to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay, a professional exile that stunned his colleagues. The man who had done more than perhaps any other individual to enable the Midway victory spent the rest of the war in obscure assignments far from combat intelligence work. After the war, efforts were made to recognize Rochefort's contributions. He was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1958, 16 years after Midway, but he never received the immediate recognition he deserved during the war itself. Rochefort retired from the Navy in 1953 and died in 1976, having lived long enough to see the story of code breaking at Midway partially declassified and publicly acknowledged. The technical work of breaking JN-25 continued throughout the war. As the Japanese modified their codes and procedures, American cryptanalysts adapted. By 1944, Station Hypo and the other cryptanalytic units were reading the majority of Japanese naval communications, sometimes within hours of transmission. This intelligence guided every major American operation in the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign, the submarine war against Japanese shipping, and the final strategic bombing of Japan all benefited from decrypted communications intelligence. The cryptanalysts who made this possible worked in anonymity, forbidden from discussing their work even with family members. They received no public recognition during the war. No medals, no headlines, no parades. But their contribution was as significant as any combat action. Breaking JN-25 gave American commanders a decisive advantage, allowing them to fight smarter rather than harder, to position forces efficiently, and to anticipate Japanese moves before they happened. The mathematical and linguistic techniques developed during the war laid foundations for modern cryptanalysis. The IBM tabulating machines used at Station Hypo were primitive ancestors of modern computers. The statistical methods used to break JN-25 informed post-war development of computational cryptography. Many of the mathematicians and engineers who worked on wartime code breaking went on to careers in early computer science, bringing with them expertise in pattern recognition, statistical analysis, and automated data processing. The organizational structures developed during the war also influenced post-war intelligence agencies. The cooperation between military cryptanalysis units and civilian mathematicians, the integration of signals intelligence with operational planning, and the security procedures for handling sensitive intelligence all became models for Cold War intelligence operations. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, inherited both personnel and procedures from wartime Navy and Army cryptanalysis units. The story of breaking JN-25 also illustrates the fundamental nature of modern warfare. Information became a weapon as important as ships, aircraft, or men. The Battle of Midway was won before the first bomb fell because American commanders knew what the Japanese were planning. This information dominance became a defining characteristic of American military power. Throughout the Cold War and into the modern era, the United States invested enormous resources in signals intelligence, cryptanalysis, and communications security, building on lessons learned in World War II. The men and women who broke JN-25 demonstrated that intellectual combat could be as decisive as physical combat. Every code group they solved, every additive they recovered, every message they decrypted contributed to victory. The work was tedious, the hours were crushing, and the recognition was non-existent during the war, but the impact was profound. For the Japanese, the failure to recognize that their codes had been compromised proved catastrophic. After Midway, they continued using JN-25 variants for the rest of the war, never fully understanding that American cryptanalysts were reading their most sensitive communications. Japanese confidence in their cryptographic security was their undoing. They had built a complex system, assumed it was unbreakable, and failed to consider that determined adversaries with enough time and resources could break any code. This lesson remains relevant in modern cybersecurity. No encryption system is truly unbreakable given sufficient computational power and analytical effort. Security depends not on perfect codes, but on making the cost of breaking a code exceed the value of the information protected. The human element of the JN-25 story is equally important. Joseph Rochefort and his team were not superhuman. They were mathematicians, linguists, and Navy officers who worked to exhaustion, breaking a code that protected information of incalculable strategic value. They made mistakes, argued with each other, competed with rival stations, and sometimes let personal ambitions interfere with cooperation. But they also achieved something extraordinary. They gave their nation a decisive advantage at a critical moment. Without their work, the Battle of Midway might have gone very differently. Admiral Nimitz would not have known where or when to position his carriers. The ambush would not have happened. The Japanese carriers might have destroyed Midway's defenses, sunk the American carriers, and achieved the decisive victory Yamamoto sought. The course of the Pacific War could have changed fundamentally. Instead, American codebreakers tipped the balance. They turned Japanese confidence in secure communications into a vulnerability. They proved that in modern warfare, the ability to read enemy plans was as valuable as superior weapons or numbers. And they did it sitting in a basement in Hawaii, drinking bad coffee and staring at seemingly random strings of numbers until patterns emerged from chaos. That basement, Building 1 at Pearl Harbor, no longer exists. It was demolished decades ago. But the legacy of what happened there endures. Every military cryptanalyst who breaks enemy codes, every signals intelligence officer who intercepts hostile communications, every cybersecurity professional who defends networks against intrusion stands in the tradition established by Rochefort's team. The specifics have changed: machines replaced by computers, radio intercepts replaced by digital communications, but the fundamental mission remains the same. Obtain information the enemy wants to keep secret. Protect information you need to keep secret. And use information dominance to achieve strategic advantage. The Battle of Midway proved that this mission could change the outcome of wars. The men who fought at Midway, the pilots who dove on Japanese carriers, the Marines who defended the island, the sailors who kept the American carriers operational, all performed with courage and skill. But they had help from men they never met, cryptanalysts working in basements thousands of miles away, breaking codes that gave those warriors the advantage they needed to win. That combination of intellectual and physical combat, of information and action, defined modern warfare. It began at Midway, enabled by the breaking of JN-25, and it continues today wherever conflicts are fought with both weapons and information. The story of how breaking Japan's JN-25 code helped win the Battle of Midway is ultimately a story about the power of knowledge. Knowledge obtained through patience, skill, mathematical brilliance, and relentless dedication. Knowledge that saved lives, won battles, and changed history. The men who obtained that knowledge remain largely unknown, overshadowed by more visible heroes, but their contribution was fundamental. Without them, Midway would be remembered differently, if it was remembered at all. With them, it became the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's offensive power was broken forever. And it all started with 5-digit numbers in a basement in Hawaii, decoded one group at a time until the enemy's secrets lay exposed.